The air in the studio was thick, almost sweet, with the smell of fresh paint and hot television lights. It was a familiar scent to the crew, a daily perfume that signaled another show was about to be born. But today was different. A low, excited hum vibrated through the usually bustling space, a current of anticipation that made even the seasoned stagehands move with a little more purpose. The warm-up comedian was working harder than usual, his jokes bouncing off an audience that was only half listening, their eyes constantly darting towards the iconic, multicolored couch where history was about to sit down. The reason for this electric atmosphere was simple, yet monumental. For the first time, two giants of the silver screen, two men who had defined what it meant to be a movie star for generations, were about to share the same small space. The occasion was a noble one, a fundraiser for a charity dedicated to building homes for disabled veterans. It was a cause that had, against all odds, managed to bring together two figures who were more like mythological creatures than actors. They were from the same world, but they had existed on different continents of that world, never quite crossing paths in any meaningful way. Now they were here, united by a shared sense of duty, and the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. The man who arrived first was a study in stillness. He moved through the backstage chaos like a ship moving through a calm sea, unaffected by the frantic energy swirling around him. At 93, his frame was still broad and imposing, but time had carved deep lines of wisdom and weariness into his face. He didn't speak much, offering a quiet nod to the producer who greeted him, his eyes a pale, piercing blue that seemed to see right through the artifice of the television set. He was a living monument, a piece of Americana made flesh, and his presence commanded a silent respect from everyone he passed. He found his mark on the couch and sat, not relaxing, but settling in, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He was here to do a job, to lend his name to a cause he believed in, and he would do it with the same no-nonsense efficiency he had brought to every film set for the last 60 years. He was a man from a different time, a time when a man's actions spoke louder than his words, and he found the modern obsession with talk and confession to be a tiresome affair. Just a few minutes later, the second guest arrived, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. Where the first man was a calm sea, this one was a coiled spring. He was 80 years old, but he moved with a restless, watchful energy, his dark eyes constantly scanning the room, taking in every detail. He offered a tight, almost shy smile to the people who greeted him, a stark contrast to the explosive force he so often projected on screen. He was an artist, a man who had burrowed so deep into the souls of his characters that it sometimes seemed he had forgotten where he ended and they began. He carried the weight of his own legend heavily, aware of the expectations that rested on his every word and gesture. He was also deeply committed to the charity, his passion for the cause evident in the serious set of his jaw. As he approached the couch, the two men exchanged a brief, perfunctory glance. There was no warmth in it, no shared camaraderie of two old pros. It was simply an acknowledgement of each other's presence. He sat down, leaving a noticeable space between himself and the other man. It wasn't a rude gesture, but a natural, unconscious one, like two animals who instinctively maintain their territory. The invisible wall between them was so real you could almost see it shimmering in the studio air. As the countdown to the show's start began, the hosts took their places, their faces a mixture of professional excitement and genuine nervousness. They knew they were not just interviewing two actors. They were curating a cultural moment. The lead host, a woman who had seen it all in her long career, beamed at the camera, her voice filled with a reverence that was entirely genuine. She introduced them, not just by name, but by their contributions to the very fabric of storytelling. The audience erupted in applause, a wave of adoration that washed over the stage. The first man responded with a slow, deliberate nod of his head, a gesture of acceptance from a king to his subjects. The second man offered a small, tight-lipped smile, a flicker of vulnerability in the face of such overwhelming affection. The initial questions were soft, designed to ease them into the conversation. They spoke about the charity, their voices filled with a shared passion that was the first and only point of connection between them. The older man spoke of the discipline of soldiers, the quiet heroism that resonated with his own worldview. The younger man spoke of the emotional scars, the need for society to embrace and heal those who had sacrificed so much. They were saying the same thing, but in completely different languages. One was about duty, the other about empathy. The host tried to build a bridge, asking them about their early days in the business, hoping to find a spark of shared memory. But the stories remained separate. The older man recalled the hard work, the long hours, the simple graft of getting the job done. The younger man spoke of the transformation, the search for truth in a character, the psychological process of becoming someone else. They sat side by side, two masters of the same craft, yet they seemed to be speaking from different planets. The audience began to feel it too. The initial thrill of seeing them together was slowly being replaced by a sense of unease, a fascination with the palpable, unspoken tension that filled the space between them. It was like watching two great chess players who refused to acknowledge each other's presence on the board. Every polite answer, every nod of the head, only seemed to reinforce the vast, uncharted distance that separated them. The segment was heading towards a commercial break, and the hosts knew they had to do something to break the ice. One of them, sensing the need to move beyond the safe and the superficial, took a deep breath and looked down at her notes. She was about to steer the conversation into more dangerous waters, to ask the question that every person in the studio, and everyone watching at home, was secretly thinking. She looked from one man to the other, her heart beating a little faster. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken history and conflicting philosophies. The calm before the storm was over. The red light on the camera faded, signaling a commercial break, and the studio let out a collective breath it didn't know it was holding. The low hum of conversation returned, but it was different now, laced with a nervous energy. Producers huddled around a monitor near the edge of the set, their faces tight with concern. They were whispering urgently, their hands gesturing towards the couch where the two legends sat in their separate worlds of silence. The interview was flat, a historical artifact that was more awkward than it was awe-inspiring. Television lived on moments, on sparks, on unexpected connections. So far there was nothing but a void. The hosts, too, were in a quick, huddled conference. They knew they had to do something. The pre-approved questions were leading them down a dead-end street. They were getting polite, professional, and profoundly boring answers. The lead host, a woman with decades of experience, felt the weight of the moment. This was more than just a show. It was a once-in-a-lifetime booking, and it was turning into a missed opportunity. She looked at her co-hosts and gave a small, decisive nod. They had to take a risk. They had to move beyond the safe harbor of their careers and the charity and touch the third rail that had been hovering over the conversation, all along, the real world. Meanwhile, on the couch, the two men remained in their own bubbles. The older man sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the studio lights. He seemed to be in a state of quiet contemplation, completely unaffected by the frantic energy around him. To him, this was just another part of the job, the necessary waiting between takes. He had spent his entire life waiting, watching, and then acting with precision and purpose. This was no different. The younger man, however, was a portrait of contained restlessness. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his fingers moving with a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. He picked up a bottle of water from the small table in front of him, unscrewed the cap, and took a small sip, his eyes scanning the faces in the audience, as if searching for a connection or a sign of understanding. He felt the awkwardness as a physical weight, a pressure in his chest. He wanted this to work. He believed in the cause, and he respected the man sitting next to him, even if he didn't know him. He was an artist who thrived on connection, on finding the emotional truth in a scene, and this emotional vacuum was deeply unsettling to him. A floor manager with a headset walked over and whispered to the hosts, giving them the 1-minute warning. The lead host took a deep, centering breath. She had formulated a question in her mind. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice. It could either ignite the conversation they needed or cause the entire carefully constructed house of cards to collapse. But she knew they were at a point where doing nothing was a bigger risk. She looked at her notes one last time, then up at the two men. She decided she would direct the question to both of them, but she had a feeling one of them would be the one to step forward first. The countdown began in the producer's booth. 10, 9, 8. The studio lights seemed to brighten, the audience hushed, and the hosts straightened their backs, their professional smiles firmly in place. The red light of the main camera blinked on. "And welcome back to The View," the lead host began, her voice smooth and warm, betraying none of the backstage anxiety. "We are here with two of the most iconic figures in the history of cinema, talking about a cause that is incredibly close to their hearts." She paused, letting the moment hang in the air. This was it. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious, more intimate. "You've both spent your lives creating characters that have become part of our cultural fabric. Characters who have shaped how we see heroes, villains, and what it means to be an American." She leaned forward slightly, making eye contact with first one man, then the other. "My question is this. We live in very loud times, very divided times. Do you feel, as artists, as these towering cultural figures, a new kind of obligation to use your platform? To not just reflect the world, but to actively try and change it, to address the political and social issues that are tearing people apart?" The question landed in the middle of the set like a stone in a still pond. The ripples were immediate. The younger man, who had been coiled with a nervous energy, suddenly seemed to find his center. He leaned into his microphone, his posture changing from restless to focused. The older man, on the other hand, remained perfectly still, but a subtle change occurred in his face. His eyes, which had been distant, now narrowed slightly, his gaze fixed on the host. It was the look of a predator who had just spotted movement in the grass. The younger man took the lead. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was filled with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. "Yes," he said, the single word carrying the weight of a deep conviction. "Absolutely. I think it's not just an obligation, it's a responsibility. It's the very reason we do what we do." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For me, acting has always been about searching for the truth of a character, the truth of a situation. And right now, the truth is that there are a lot of people who are hurting, a lot of people who are being ignored, a lot of injustices that are happening out in the open." As he spoke, his passion began to build, not into a fire, but into a steady, powerful current. To be an artist and to turn your back on that. To just say, "Oh, I'm just an entertainer." That feels like a betrayal. It feels like you're hiding. Silence in the face of injustice is a form of consent. You have to stand up and say something. You have to use the voice that people have given you, not for your own sake, but for those who don't have a voice. He looked directly into the camera, his dark eyes burning with sincerity. "It's not about telling people what to think. It's about making them think. It's about holding up a mirror to society and saying, 'Look, this is what's happening. Is this who we want to be?' That's the power of art. It's not just an escape. It's a confrontation. It's a conversation." He finished, and a thoughtful silence fell over the studio. It was a powerful, eloquent answer, a defense of the artist as a citizen. The hosts were nodding, impressed. The audience seemed captivated. But the camera, ever watchful, had stayed on the face of the older man. And while the younger man was speaking, a storm had been gathering behind those pale blue eyes. It had started with a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Then his jaw had tightened, the muscles flexing like a clenched fist. A flicker of something like contempt had crossed his face so quickly that most people would have missed it. But the camera didn't miss it. He wasn't just disagreeing. He was visibly, deeply offended by what he was hearing. To him, it wasn't a passionate defense of art. It was a self-important justification for preaching. He saw it as a betrayal of the very craft they had both dedicated their lives to. He saw it as a confusion between the role of the artist and the role of the politician. He sat there, a statue of simmering disapproval, the air around him growing colder and heavier with every word the other man spoke. The younger man's passionate speech had not built a bridge. It had just poured gasoline on a fire that no one else knew was burning. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the tense, heavy silence that comes right before an explosion. The silence that followed the younger man's passionate speech was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It wasn't a peaceful or thoughtful silence. It was a vacuum filled with unspoken tension. In the control room, producers held their breath, their eyes glued to the monitors. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a crack in the facade, but it was so much more volatile than they had ever imagined. One of the hosts, sensing the need to fill the void, leaned forward with a practiced, sympathetic smile. "That was so beautifully put," she began, her voice a little too bright, a little too eager to smooth things over. The idea of holding up a mirror to society, of making people think, that's the true power of art, isn't it? She was trying to validate the younger man, to build a bridge of agreement, but her words were like a lit match dropped into a pool of gasoline. From the far end of the couch came a sound. It was low and guttural, a noise of pure, unfiltered contempt. It was a scoff, loud and raw, and it cut through the host's polished words like a rusty saw. Every head in the studio snapped towards the source. The older man hadn't moved, but his entire posture had changed. The stillness was no longer calm. It was predatory. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment etched onto his weathered face. He wasn't just disagreeing. He was disgusted. The host who had spoken froze, her smile plastered on her face, her eyes wide with alarm. The other hosts looked at each other, a silent, panicked question passing between them. "What do we do now?" Before any of them could formulate a plan, the older man leaned forward, his body coiling with a terrifying energy. He didn't look at the hosts. He didn't look at the camera. He fixed his pale, piercing eyes directly on the man sitting beside him. When he spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was a low, dangerous rumble, like the sound of an earthquake deep underground. It was so quiet that the microphones had to struggle to pick it up, which somehow made it even more menacing. "Responsibility?" he repeated, the word dripping with a scorn so thick you could almost taste it. He let out a short, harsh laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Our responsibility is to the story, to the character, not to some damn political agenda." The air in the studio grew cold. The audience, which had been captivated moments before, was now frozen in a state of collective shock. A few audible gasps rippled through the rows of seats. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a public execution. The younger man sat perfectly still, his face a mask of disbelief. The passionate fire in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a deep, wounded confusion. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a lightning bolt he never saw coming. The older man wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower, making it intensely personal. "You're confusing acting with preaching. People go to the movies to be entertained, to get away from all this crap for 2 hours. They don't need us, a couple of actors, lecturing them from a screen. That's not art, it's propaganda. You're tarnishing the whole profession." The word tarnishing hung in the air, a brutal, deliberate insult. It was an attack not just on an opinion, but on a legacy, on a life's work. One of the other hosts, a woman known for her quick wit, finally found her voice. "Now, hold on a second," she interjected, trying to inject a note of reason into the escalating chaos. "I think we can all agree that there's a place for both, for entertainment and for art that challenges us." But the older man waved her away with an impatient flick of his hand, a gesture of utter dismissal that was more insulting than any word. He wasn't there to debate. He was there to pass judgment. He turned his gaze back to the younger man, who had not moved a muscle, whose face remained a pale, stoic mask. But if you looked closely, you could see a flicker of pain in his dark eyes. The words were not just bouncing off him. They were burrowing deep. "We built legends by making people feel something," the older man continued, his voice gaining a slight edge, a hint of the legendary fury he had channeled on screen for decades. Joy, fear, anger, hope. We made them feel the humanity of a situation. We didn't stand on a soapbox and tell them what to think. There's a difference, son. A big damn difference. The use of the word son was the final crushing blow. It was condescending, paternalistic, and designed to put the younger man in his place. Not as an equal, but as a naive child who needed to be schooled. The studio was utterly silent now, save for the low, menacing voice of the older man. The hosts were powerless, mere spectators to a historic collision of titans. The cameras rolled on, capturing every raw, painful second. This was live television at its most terrifying and most compelling. The younger man finally moved. He didn't speak. He didn't retaliate. He just slowly lowered his eyes from the older man's face and stared down at his hands, which were resting limply in his lap. It was a gesture of defeat, of quiet, profound humiliation. In that moment, he wasn't a screen legend, a tough guy, or an artistic icon. He was just a man, publicly and viciously dressed down by a peer he had, until this moment, respected from afar. The older man seemed to take this as a sign of victory. He leaned back into his seat, his expression hardening into one of grim satisfaction. He had said his piece. He had made his point. The damage was done. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the studio, loud and frantic in the deafening silence. Cut to commercial now. Go, go, go. It was the floor manager, his voice stripped of its usual professional calm, filled with naked panic. The red light on the main camera flicked off. The host let out a shaky, collective breath. The screen abruptly faded to black, cutting away from the devastating scene and replacing it with a cheerful, upbeat advertisement for a new brand of yogurt. The whiplash was jarring, but in the studio there was no escape. The commercial break offered no relief. It only amplified the horror of what had just transpired. The two men sat side by side, not looking at each other, the space between them now a chasm of public humiliation and righteous anger. The explosion had happened, and the fallout was just beginning. What happened next, behind the scenes and in the minutes that followed, would truly shock everyone. The moment the red light on the camera died, the studio erupted. It wasn't a sound of applause or chatter, but a frantic, chaotic wave of noise and motion. Producers were shouting into their headsets, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The floor manager, who had been the one to scream for the commercial break, was now pacing frantically in front of the stage, his hands gesticulating wildly as he barked orders into his microphone. Security guards, who had been standing casually by the exits, had moved closer, their eyes fixed on the couch, unsure of what to expect but ready for anything. It was the kind of backstage meltdown that legends are made of, the kind of story that would be told in production offices for years to come. The assumption rippling through the crew was that this was a catastrophe. One of the legends, or perhaps both, would storm off the set. The interview was over. The charity event was a disaster. All that was left was the fallout. But on the couch, the epicenter of the explosion, there was an unnerving quiet. The two men sat as if carved from stone, trapped in their own separate worlds of the aftermath. The older man, who had been a volcano of righteous fury just moments before, now seemed to shrink. The formidable energy that had propelled his tirade had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, weary shell. He stared down at his own hands, large and gnarled, the hands of a working man who had lived a long and full life. They looked foreign to him now, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who had just done a terrible thing. His anger, which had felt so pure and justified in the moment, now curdled into something else. It wasn't regret, not yet. It was a profound, aching sadness. He had seen a trend he hated, a world he no longer recognized, and he had lashed out. But in the cold, silent aftermath, looking at the man beside him, he didn't see an ideological opponent. He just saw an old man, a contemporary, someone who had shared the same rarefied air of cinematic greatness for half a century. And he had just tried to tear him down on national television. The weight of that settled on him, heavy and suffocating. The younger man was a portrait of stillness, but it was a different kind of stillness than before. It wasn't the coiled, nervous energy of an artist waiting for his moment. It was the stillness of a statue that had been vandalized, its defacement plain for all the world to see. He kept his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor just in front of his feet. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, burning sensation in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had spoken from the heart, from a place of deep conviction about his responsibility as an artist, and he had been publicly shamed for it. He had been called a fraud, a preacher, a man who was tarnishing their profession. The words echoed in his head, each one a fresh wound. He felt the eyes of the entire crew on him, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and vanish. But he didn't move. He just sat there, taking it, absorbing the pain, his face a mask of stoic endurance. This was the part of acting he knew best, the quiet, internal suffering of a character who has been broken. The hosts, who had been huddled together in a whispered, panicked huddle, now cautiously approached the couch. They didn't know what to say. How do you smooth this over? Sorry, he called you a fraud on live TV. Can we talk about housing for veterans now? It was impossible. They were like diplomats arriving at a peace treaty that had already been shattered before the ink was dry. As they stood there, awkward and helpless, something happened that no one, not the producers, not the hosts, not the security guards, could have ever predicted. The younger man, the one who had been publicly humiliated, slowly lifted his head. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like he was about to retaliate. His dark eyes, usually so intense and probing, were filled with a deep, quiet sadness. And then, in a move that silenced the entire chaotic studio, he reached out. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, through the thick, poisoned air between them and came to rest gently on the older man's arm. It was a simple gesture, a human gesture. But in that context, it was more shocking than the original explosion. The older man flinched at the touch, as if startled. He slowly lifted his head, his pale blue eyes meeting the younger man's gaze. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The decades of rivalry, of separate paths, of unspoken differences all fell away. In that moment, they were not two cinematic titans. They were just two old men, sitting on a couch, one having inflicted a deep wound, the other offering a surprising, gentle touch of compassion. The producers in the control room, who had been watching the monitors in horror, were now completely silent. They leaned closer to their screens, their mouths agape. This was not in the playbook. This was not supposed to happen. The younger man spoke, his voice barely a whisper, so quiet that the microphones barely picked it up. It was not a voice of accusation or anger. It was a voice of genuine, wounded confusion. You really think that's all I'm doing, Clint? He asked, his voice cracking slightly on the name. Tarnishing it? The question hung in the air, fragile and heartbreaking. It wasn't a challenge. It was a plea. It was the question of a student asking a master if his life's work has been a mistake. It stripped away all the ego and all the politics and laid bare the simple, human core of their conflict. The older man didn't have an answer. He looked at the hand on his arm, then back at the younger man's face. The hard, righteous facade had completely crumbled, replaced by a look of profound uncertainty. He had been so sure of himself, so sure of his position. But this simple question, this quiet act of grace, had shaken him to his core. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just shook his head, a slow, slight movement, not of negation, but of bewilderment. He was a man who had always had the answers, who had always been in control. And now, for the first time in a very long time, he was lost. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't a tense, angry silence. It was a heavy, sacred silence. It was the silence of two men in front of millions of people having a moment of raw, unscripted, and deeply human connection. The chaos of the studio had faded into the background. The frantic producers, the nervous hosts, the curious crew, they were all just spectators now, witnessing something that felt incredibly private and profoundly real. The commercial break was winding down. A floor manager, his voice now hushed and respectful, held up his fingers. 30 seconds, everyone. The spell was about to be broken. They would have to go back on air, back to the show, back to the public performance. But something had fundamentally shifted on that couch. The invisible wall between them had not just been cracked. It had been completely obliterated, replaced by something fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real. The older man finally found his voice, but it was not the booming, judgmental voice from before. It was a low, rough whisper. He started, then stopped, shaking his head again. He looked at the younger man, his eyes filled with a complexity of emotions that no camera could ever capture. "I don't know, Bobby," he finally said, the use of the familiar nickname a startling admission of a shared history. "I really don't know." And in that moment of honest vulnerability, the true shock was revealed. It wasn't the explosion that had shocked everyone. It was the quiet, painful, and ultimately beautiful aftermath. The countdown in the producer's booth felt like the ticking of a time bomb. 5, 4. The floor manager, his face still pale, pointed at the lead host, then at the two men on the couch, his expression a silent plea for a miracle. The studio was no longer chaotic. It was a cathedral of hushed anticipation. Every crew member, every camera operator, every audience member was leaning in, their bodies coiled with a nervous energy that was palpable. The two men on the couch remained still, but the space between them had been transformed. The poisonous fog of anger and humiliation had dissipated, replaced by a fragile, almost sacred quiet. The older man's hand, which had been resting limply on his knee, now lay near the younger man's, which was still on his arm. The physical connection was still there, a quiet anchor in the storm of public expectation. 3, 2. The lead host took a final, deep breath. She knew that any question she asked now could either shatter this delicate truce or somehow, miraculously, guide it to a safe shore. She abandoned all her prepared notes. This was no longer about a script. This was about navigating a raw, human moment in front of millions of people. 1. The red light on the main camera blinked back on. "And welcome back," she began, her voice softer than before, stripped of its usual professional polish. It was the voice of someone who was also a witness, not just a moderator. "We are here with two giants of cinema." She paused, struggling for the right words, talking about a cause that is clearly very important to them. She decided not to acknowledge the explosion. To talk about it would be to give it more power, to force them to relive it. Instead, she did the only thing she could do. She gently guided the conversation back to the one place of common ground they had left. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone gentle, almost reverent. "Before the break, we were talking about the charity, about the men and women coming home. Perhaps we could talk about what we as a society owe them." It was a simple, open-ended question. A lifeline. The older man was the first to respond. He didn't lean into his microphone with aggression. He didn't even look at the host. He looked out at the audience, his gaze distant, as if seeing something far beyond the studio walls. When he spoke, his voice was no longer a dangerous rumble. It was low, rough, and filled with a deep, weary sadness. "We owe them a chance," he said, the words coming out slowly, as if each one was heavy. "A chance to have a life. To come back to a world that makes sense. They go out there and follow orders, they do a job, a hard job, and they expect to come back to a country that's solid. That works." He paused, and for the first time, he looked at the younger man sitting beside him. There was no anger in his eyes now, only a profound, searching question. "They just want things to be right." The younger man, who had been listening intently, nodded slowly. He understood. He wasn't hearing a political statement anymore. He was hearing the cry of a man from a generation that believed in order, in duty, in a world with clear lines. He leaned into his microphone, his voice also quiet, but filled with a new, empathetic resonance. "And sometimes," he said, his eyes meeting the older man's, "the world isn't right. And it's not their fault. They come back, and they're broken. Not just in their bodies, but in here," he said, tapping his chest lightly. "And we owe them more than just a house. We owe them understanding. We owe them a hand to hold, not just a medal to pin on their chest. We owe them a chance to heal their souls." The studio was silent. The two men were talking about the same thing, the care of veterans, but they were describing it from two different yet now harmonious perspectives. One was about building a solid structure, the other was about healing the person inside it. They weren't contradicting each other anymore. They were completing each other's sentences. The older man listened to the younger man speak, and a flicker of something new crossed his face. It was understanding. He had spent his life playing men of action, men who solved problems with their hands and their will. He saw the world as a series of tasks to be completed, a fence to be mended, a town to be saved. But he was now hearing from a man who had spent his life exploring the messy, complicated interior of people. And for the first time he saw the value in it. He saw that healing a soul was just as important as building a wall. He felt a pang of regret for his earlier anger, not because he was wrong to believe what he believed, but because he had been so arrogant in his certainty that he had refused to even listen to the other side. The younger man, in turn, felt a wave of compassion wash over him. He saw the older man not as a stubborn old ideologue, but as a guardian of a world that was slipping away. The older man's anger wasn't malice. It was fear. A fear of losing the solid ground he had stood on his entire life. And in that moment of understanding, the humiliation he had felt on the couch melted away, replaced by a sense of connection to this complex, flawed, and brilliant man sitting next to him. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, but it was a different show entirely. They spoke of the charity, not as a duty, but as a shared mission. They found common ground in stories of individual soldiers they had met, their voices sometimes overlapping in agreement. They didn't look at each other often, but when they did, there was no hostility. There was a quiet, mutual respect that had been forged in the fire of their public conflict. It was a truce born not of surrender, but of a grudging, profound understanding. When the show finally drew to a close, the lead host struggled to find a way to end it. There was no neat summary, no tidy takeaway. I don't think any of us will ever forget this, she finally said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. Thank you both, for your honesty and for your passion. The audience erupted in applause, but it was different from the beginning of the show. It wasn't just applause for icons. It was a standing ovation for two men who had just shown the world what it looked like to have a terrible fight, and then find a way, in the most public of arenas, to forge a peace. As the credits rolled, the two men stood up. They did not hug. They did not shake hands for the cameras. The older man simply gave the younger man a slow, deliberate nod. The younger man returned it. It was a small gesture, a silent acknowledgement. It was the only apology and the only forgiveness that was needed. They walked off the stage in opposite directions, disappearing into the wings of the studio, leaving behind a stunned and deeply moved audience. The world would see the clips of the explosion, the headlines would scream about the on-air feud. But the people in that studio, the hosts and the crew who had witnessed the entire, unedited event, knew the real story. The shocking thing wasn't that two legends had a fight. The shocking thing was what happened after. It was the quiet, painful, and ultimately beautiful moment when two proud men, at the end of their long and storied careers, chose understanding over anger and compassion over conflict. It was a reminder that even the most unshakable monuments are, underneath it all, just human beings, searching for a little bit of common ground in a divided world.